Ever wondered how medieval people created weapons designed not to kill bodies, but to shatter minds? Historical records reveal actual devices engineered specifically to drive enemies completely insane through psychological terror. These weren't myths, they were real weapons used in documented battles and sieges that broke warriors' sanity before breaking their bones. Ready to discover the most psychologically devastating arsenal that really existed. 1. Warhammers. Medieval warhammers were engineered specifically to cause maximum psychological trauma through systematic skull crushing that kept victims conscious during brain destruction. Unlike swift sword deaths, warhammer attacks created prolonged dying processes that drove witnessing enemies insane with anticipatory horror. The technique involved precise blunt force trauma that caused visible brain damage while maintaining victim consciousness, creating psychological warfare. Through systematic demonstration of slow neurological destruction, different hammer designs offered varying psychological effects: spiked versions for maximum visual horror, flanged models for systematic bone crushing, and specialized executioner hammers designed for public psychological demonstration. Battlefield. Reports describe warhammer victims surviving hours with visible brain injuries, creating such psychological trauma in enemy forces that entire armies fled rather than risk similar fates. Museum collections show specialized hammer designs, created specifically for maximum psychological impact rather than quick killing, proving deliberate psychological warfare through prolonged neurological trauma. 2. Siege engines. Medieval trebuchets weren't just physical weapons. They were psychological torture devices that drove defending populations insane through constant bombardment. The technique involved systematic psychological warfare, using precisely timed stone impacts that prevented sleep, caused anticipatory anxiety, and created mass psychological breakdown among defenders. Different trebuchet designs created varying psychological effects: rapid-fire machines for constant terror, massive engines for overwhelming dread, and specialized projectile catapults that hurled diseased corpses to create biological and psychological warfare simultaneously. Chronicle accounts describe defenders becoming completely non-functional due to trebuchet-induced madness, abandoning defensive positions and attacking each other in psychological collapse before walls were breached. 3. Boiling oil. Medieval defenders used boiling oil as psychological warfare that drove attackers completely insane through anticipation of unimaginable agony. The terror wasn't just physical pain, it was systematic psychological destruction through the promise of prolonged, inescapable burning that would continue long after initial contact. Castle records describe elaborate oil heating systems designed for maximum psychological impact rather than military efficiency. Multiple cauldrons were positioned visibly above gates and walls, creating overwhelming psychological pressure on attacking forces who could see their inevitable fate. The technique involved precise temperature control that maximized psychological terror. Oil, hot enough to cause instant severe burns, but not so hot that it killed quickly. Different oil-based psychological warfare methods created varying mental effects: visible heating demonstrations for anticipatory terror, systematic pouring patterns that prolonged psychological torture, and deliberate near misses that created lasting trauma in surviving attackers. Architectural studies show castle modifications specifically designed for oil-based psychological warfare, and observation positions that allowed defenders to witness psychological breakdown in attacking forces. Historical siege accounts describe armies abandoning attacks after witnessing oil demonstrations, proving effectiveness of psychological warfare over actual defensive necessity. 4. Flail. Weapons. Medieval flails created unpredictable striking patterns that drove enemies insane through impossible-to-defend attacks that seemed to violate natural weapon physics. The psychological terror came from weapons that struck from impossible angles, wrapping around shields and armor in ways that defied rational understanding of combat mechanics. Excavation findings from medieval battlefields show flail designs specifically engineered for psychological warfare rather than efficient killing. Different flail configurations created varying psychological effects: spring-headed versions for unpredictable impact patterns, multi-headed variants for overwhelming sensory confusion, and specialized chain lengths calculated to create maximum psychological disorientation. The technique involved exploiting human psychological expectations about weapon behavior, creating attacks that seemed supernatural or impossible to comprehend. Military chronicles describe enemies becoming paralyzed with fear when facing flail-wielding warriors because traditional defensive techniques proved completely ineffective against unpredictable strike patterns. Medieval military manuals describe systematic flail training focused on psychological impact, creating weapon movements that appeared random while following calculated patterns designed to break enemy mental stability through sensory overload and defensive helplessness. Modern weapon physics analysis confirms these designs achieved maximum psychological trauma through systematic violation of combat expectations. 5. Greek fire Byzantine military engineers perfected liquid fire that burned on water and couldn't be extinguished, driving enemy sailors completely insane with supernatural terror. Historical accounts describe warriors jumping overboard to escape flames that followed them underwater. The psychological impact was devastating. Enemies surrendered rather than face this impossible fire. Naval battle records show specialized siphon systems designed for maximum psychological effect. Modern chemical analysis proves this napalm-like substance created temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, while producing toxic fumes that caused hallucinations and mental breakdown in exposed victims. 6. Iron Maiden medieval executioners perfected the Iron Maiden, specifically to drive condemned prisoners completely insane before death through systematic psychological torture. The genius lay not in killing efficiency, but in creating prolonged mental breakdown through anticipation of inevitable, inescapable penetration by precisely positioned spikes. Execution chamber records describe Iron Maiden designs engineered for maximum psychological impact. Spikes positioned to pierce non-vital organs first, creating extended dying processes that allowed complete mental destruction before death. The technique involved understanding human psychology and systematically exploiting every fear response through calculated physical and psychological torture. Different Iron Maiden variations offered varying psychological effects, standard models. For basic terror execution, specialized versions with movable spikes for extended psychological torture, and demonstration models used for psychological warfare without actual execution. Surviving artifacts show Iron Maiden construction techniques specifically designed for psychological rather than physical efficiency. The psychological impact extended beyond individual victims. Public Iron Maiden demonstrations created community-wide psychological trauma that prevented rebellion through overwhelming terror display. Medieval execution manuals describe precise protocols for achieving victim insanity, while maximizing witness psychological impact, proving systematic understanding of psychological warfare through execution theater, designed to break both individual and collective resistance. 7. Rack torture medieval interrogators perfected the rack as psychological warfare that drove victims insane through systematic limb displacement while maintaining consciousness for extended mental torture. The technique involved precise mechanical advantage that separated joints slowly enough to prevent shock-induced unconsciousness while maximizing psychological trauma through anticipated bodily destruction. Different rack designs created varying psychological effects, standard models for basic limb separation, specialized versions with adjustable tension for extended psychological torture, and demonstration racks designed for psychological warfare through threat display rather than actual use. Construction blueprints show rack engineering, specifically designed for psychological rather than interrogation efficiency. The genius lay in understanding human psychology and exploiting anticipatory fear through systematic demonstration of inevitable bodily destruction. Torture chamber logs describe rack sessions lasting hours, while victims remained conscious, creating complete psychological breakdown before significant physical damage occurred. Medieval interrogation manuals detail precise protocols for rack-based psychological warfare timing systems that maximized anticipatory terror, positioning techniques that allowed witnesses to observe psychological breakdown, and systematic approaches to mental destruction that proved more effective than physical torture alone. Modern psychological analysis of medieval rack techniques reveals understanding of trauma psychology that exceeds contemporary torture methods for achieving complete mental submission through systematic anticipatory terror. 8. Judas Cradle medieval Torturers engineered the Judas cradle specifically to drive victims insane through systematic impalement that maintained consciousness while creating inescapable psychological horror. The technique involved precise pyramid positioning that created gradual penetration impossible to avoid, generating complete psychological breakdown through anticipation of inevitable bodily destruction. The genius lay in understanding human psychology and systematically exploiting every fear response through calculated physical positioning and psychological manipulation. Victims remained conscious throughout extended torture sessions, experiencing complete mental destruction before significant physical damage occurred. Inquisition documents describe Judas cradle sessions creating permanent psychological disorders in surviving victims. Different cradle designs offered varying psychological effects: standard pyramids for basic penetration, terror, adjustable models for extended psychological torture, and specialized versions designed for specific psychological warfare applications. Technical diagrams show cradle construction techniques focused on psychological rather than execution efficiency. Medieval torture manuals describe systematic approaches to cradle-based psychological warfare, victim positioning for maximum psychological impact, timing protocols that extended anticipatory terror, and witness arrangements that amplified psychological trauma through observation of systematic mental breakdown. The psychological impact extended beyond individual victims, creating community-wide terror that prevented resistance through overwhelming demonstration of inescapable psychological destruction. Modern psychological analysis reveals medieval understanding of trauma psychology that achieved complete mental submission. Through systematic exploitation of anticipatory fear and bodily vulnerability. 9. Pair anguish. Medieval interrogators created the pair of anguish as psychological warfare that drove victims insane through systematic expansion torture that seemed to violate natural body limits. The technique involved gradual mechanical expansion that created psychological breakdown through anticipation of impossible bodily destruction, while maintaining consciousness for extended mental torture. The genius lay in exploiting fundamental human fears about bodily integrity and creating psychological trauma through systematic violation of physical boundaries that seemed impossible to survive. Tribunal records describe pair sessions creating immediate psychological breakdown in victims who experienced complete mental submission before significant physical expansion occurred. Different pair designs created varying psychological effects: basic models for standard expansion terror, specialized versions with decorative elements that amplified psychological horror, and demonstration pairs used for psychological warfare through threat display. Engineering specifications show pair construction specifically designed for psychological impact rather than interrogation efficiency. Medieval torture chambers incorporated pair displays designed for maximum psychological warfare, positioning that allowed multiple victims to witness systematic mental breakdown, timing systems that extended anticipatory terror, and specialized procedures that created community-wide psychological trauma through systematic demonstration of inescapable bodily violation. The psychological impact proved more devastating than physical torture. Victims developed permanent psychological disorders that persisted long after physical recovery, creating lasting terror that prevented resistance through systematic exploitation of fundamental human fears about bodily autonomy and integrity. 10. Thumbscrew madness. Medieval interrogators perfected thumbscrews as psychological warfare that drove victims completely insane. Through systematic finger destruction while maintaining consciousness for extended mental torture, the technique involved precise pressure application that crushed finger bones slowly enough to prevent shock-induced unconsciousness while maximizing psychological trauma through anticipated hand destruction. Different thumbscrew designs created varying psychological effects: basic models for standard crushing terror, specialized versions with serrated surfaces that amplified psychological horror, and demonstration screws used for psychological warfare through systematic threat display. Judicial proceedings describe thumbscrew sessions creating immediate psychological breakdown in victims who experienced complete mental submission before significant bone crushing occurred. The genius lay in understanding human psychology and exploiting the connection between hand integrity and personal identity, destroying the tools that defined human capability while creating psychological trauma that exceeded physical pain. Mechanical drawings show thumbscrew construction techniques specifically designed for psychological rather than interrogation efficiency. Medieval interrogation chambers incorporated thumbscrew displays designed for maximum psychological warfare. Multiple devices positioned for witness observation. Systematic demonstration protocols that created anticipatory terror, and specialized procedures that achieved complete mental breakdown through systematic finger destruction. The psychological impact extended beyond individual victims, creating community-wide terror that prevented resistance through overwhelming demonstration of systematic bodily destruction. Modern psychological analysis reveals medieval understanding of trauma psychology that achieved complete mental submission through exploitation of fundamental fears about bodily autonomy and functional capability. 11. Breaking wheel. Medieval executioners engineered the breaking wheel as psychological warfare that drove victims and witnesses completely insane through systematic bone destruction while maintaining consciousness for extended public torture display. The technique involved precise impact timing that broke bones systematically without causing immediate death, creating prolonged psychological horror for maximum community terror impact. The genius lay in creating public spectacle that achieved psychological warfare through systematic demonstration of complete bodily destruction while preventing quick death that would end psychological trauma display. Public execution records describe wheel sessions lasting hours while victims remained conscious, creating community-wide psychological breakdown among witnesses. Different wheel designs created varying psychological effects. Standard models for basic bone-breaking terror, specialized versions with adjustable heights for extended torture display, and demonstration wheels designed for psychological warfare through systematic threat exhibition. Craftsman guilds show wheel construction, specifically engineered for psychological impact rather than execution efficiency. Medieval execution grounds incorporated wheel displays designed for maximum psychological warfare, positioning that allowed community observation of systematic mental breakdown. Timing protocols that extended public psychological torture, and specialized procedures that created lasting terror through systematic demonstration of complete bodily destruction. The psychological impact proved more devastating than individual execution. Entire communities developed collective psychological trauma that prevented rebellion through overwhelming terror display. Public wheel executions created psychological disorders that persisted for generations, proving effectiveness of systematic psychological warfare through systematic exploitation of fundamental human fears about bodily integrity and public humiliation. 12. Scavenger daughter. Medieval torturers created the scavenger's daughter as psychological warfare that drove victims insane through systematic compression torture that seemed to violate natural human body limits. The technique involved gradual mechanical compression that folded victims into impossible positions while maintaining consciousness for extended psychological torture through anticipated bodily destruction. The genius lay in exploiting fundamental human fears about bodily autonomy and creating psychological trauma through systematic violation of natural body positioning that appeared impossible to survive. Prison administrative files describe scavenger's daughter sessions creating immediate psychological breakdown in victims who experienced complete mental submission before significant physical compression occurred. Different compression designs created varying psychological effects. Standard models for basic folding terror, specialized versions with adjustable pressure for extended psychological torture, and demonstration devices used for psychological warfare through systematic threat display. Workshop inventories show compression construction techniques specifically designed for psychological impact rather than interrogation efficiency. Medieval torture chambers incorporated scavenger's daughter displays designed for maximum psychological warfare positioning that allowed witness observation of systematic mental breakdown, compression timing that extended anticipatory terror, and specialized procedures that created community-wide psychological trauma through systematic demonstration of impossible bodily violation. The psychological impact extended beyond individual victims. Families developed collective trauma from witnessing systematic body compression that seemed to defy natural human limits. Modern psychological analysis reveals medieval understanding of trauma psychology that achieved complete mental submission through systematic exploitation of fundamental fears about bodily integrity and spatial confinement that created lasting psychological disorders persisting long after physical recovery. Ready to discover more shocking medieval warfare techniques that would terrify modern people? Subscribe to our channel for weekly videos revealing forgotten historical knowledge about humanity's darkest military innovations. Hit that notification bell so you never miss mind-blowing revelations about medieval psychological warfare that modern militaries still study today.